Even if I have one day left in my life, I will spend it to destroy Google. But what makes Apple hate Google so much? In this video, we want to understand how the friendly relationship between Apple and Google has turned into an enemy. Since its founding in 1976 by Steve Jobs, Apple has had conflicts and disputes with all Silicon Valley companies. From companies like Microsoft and IBM to Dell. But his relationship with Google was completely different. It started with friendship and ended with hatred and revenge. In the early years when Google was founded, the founders of Google, Mr. Larry Page and Mr. Brin, spent many hours in Steve Jobs' office. And for years there was a friendly relationship between the founders of these two companies. This relationship continued until 2001 when Steve Jobs returned to Apple and Eric Schmidt became president of Google. The two companies had two goals in common, and that was to prevent Microsoft from dominating the PC market, and generally preventing the growth of Microsoft and Bill Gates. In 2005, an agreement was reached between Google and Apple that Apple's Mac computers would use Google's search engine by default. One of the former managers of Apple says that Tim Cook, who is also the current president of Apple, realized the extremely high potential of this contract and believed that this contract is a net profit for Apple and that the relationship between Apple and Google is necessary for the implementation of this contract. It was so sincere and close that even Steve Jobs offered Eric Schmidt to join the board of directors of Apple. In 2007, Apple introduced the first iPhone. A product that Apple has been working on developing for 2 years. Before introducing the iPhone, Apple decided to use the Google search engine on the iPhone. Even at the presentation of the iPhone, Steve Jobs invited Eric Schmidt to appear on stage. But this friendship did not continue. In the same year, Google wanted to release a phone similar to BlackBerry, but after seeing the success of the iPhone, it started to produce a phone competitor that used the Android operating system. And in 2008, Google released the first Android phone called the HTC Dream with the help of the HTC company. And 2 years later, in 2010, Apple formally sued HTC for using Android and infringing 20 Apple patents. And it was at the same time that Steve Jobs used the phrase "Don't be evil, Google." But this complaint and threats of Steve Jobs had no effect on Google, and later that year it unveiled Nexus One, it clearly modeled after the iPhone. And then Google equipped Nexus One with multi-touch functionality and a software update. This feature was patented by Apple and Apple was very sensitive about it. A year later, Apple unveiled the iPhone 4S and Siri, which this time did not use Google's search engine and used Microsoft's Bing, which was a very strange event. All these events happened while the contract between Google and Apple was still standing. And because of this contract, the negotiations between Apple and Google continued, and at any time Apple asked for more money from Google. This competition and enmity continued until 2017, until the validity of this contract ended. And the two companies had to negotiate to renew this contract. And now what happened during this time? Many users did not click on Google ads, and on the other hand, Apple was not satisfied with Microsoft's Bing search engine. Because of Tim Cook's ambitious goals, it was only possible with Google Payments. He renewed his contract again in the fall of 2017. This contract was worth billions of dollars for both companies, and it would make them remain as technology giants. As a result, the relationship between these two companies became friendly after many years. And the story of Steve Jobs' grudge against Google was completely forgotten. And of course, many experts and technology specialists believe that the cooperation of these two companies hinders the growth of smaller companies. For example, Mr. Bruce Sewell, who was one of Apple's former advisors, pointed out that Apple and Google desperately need to work together, because it brings many benefits for both parties. Apple receives between $8 and $12 billion annually from Google to include Google's search engine in its devices. This is the highest amount that Google pays to a company. It is interesting to know that more than 15% of Apple's annual income comes from this contract.